So I'm going to host the next panel. So I invite the panelists. I see 3 of you, or 4 of you. Just come on up here. The microphones are here, and we'll talk a bit about, this next session will focus in on the Jakarta market. So coming up is Oscar, Oscar from Digital Edge DC, Billy from DCI Indonesia, Dondy from Biznet Networks, or just Biznet? Biznet Geo, that was it, I'm sorry. And then ZP from K2 Data Centers Quant Group. And we have another slide, right? Or I should just give you, I'll leave this here. Oh yeah, let's try and sit so everybody. So, Oscar, you're beside me. So hopefully that was some decent context and backdrop for this discussion. And so, you heard from us, third-party independent research, and now we can hear, this is a group collected from the operating side, so all 4 companies operating in different regions and in different kind of categories within the marketplace, but all exposed to a lot of these growth dynamics. So I think we have a decent amount of time, so maybe I'll just let you guys quickly, or I already introduced you, so we'll just jump into it. So, I mean, there's so many different things that have happened. I mean, we're going to talk about, the self-bid impact. But actually, one of the things I maybe didn't present was that, and that I'd love to hear your perspective, because you guys are actually operating. The competitive landscape when I first started coming here was, mostly, local companies. And then kind of the first entry was NTT's acquisition. What was that called? Cyber CSF, yeah. So that was, I don't know, 2014, 15, so that was quite a while ago. So it's kind of the first kind of non-local entity that was in the, entity, get that? Okay, nobody got it. But then the market has changed, right? So there are a lot of kind of US global operators now, and of course some that are not operating but have kind of been circling and been, but just from your individual companies, like how has that kind of impacted, just how have you seen that impact the landscape? Are there positives, there are benefits? And Oscar, you're kind of interesting company as well, because you're kind of local, but part of a larger Pan-Asian group. So maybe we'll start with you.
All right, thanks, Phil. So, yeah, I think the question is interesting because, I think co-location market in Indonesia is relatively, it has been around for more than 10 years, but I guess it started off with, Sigma, Telkom Sigma, all right, and then it revolves, and there's also the cyber one, that's where, the legacy hotel carriers. So, and you see, it started in 2017, that's when the first wave of hyperscale or the clouds coming into Indonesia. And everybody now look at Indonesia as the new, the new sexy market in Southeast Asia. So I would say that it's very obvious and apparent that a lot of U.S. U.S. global players, or even the Pan-Asians like ourselves, Digital Edge, the other players coming into this market because the growth is still very good, as you mentioned in your report, right? Still 22%, and looking at the comparison between, even our neighboring country, Singapore, right? The market size in Singapore is somewhere between 500, 600, maybe 700 megawatt, whereas Indonesia is still 150. So it's natural just for all these players to come in and to get a share of some of the pie in the market.
Who wants to go next? What do you think of the impact of kind of global players or companies from outside Indonesia?
I approach it from I guess my esteemed partners here are local, and I do represent a kind of a foreign head operating in Indonesian waters. But I think it's no secret that almost every major data center operator had already bought land somewhere in Jakarta. I think the difference is that who had or who has the conviction to go ahead beyond land banking, and we still find that I would say it's relatively limited from an international operator perspective. But the local players have been definitely, they are local, so they know the market maybe better than anyone else, and they have been more aggressive. So a lot of the supply you would observe in the market are actually coming from the local players, and they have a different perspective in terms of the market. They do stretch across all the way from targeting the enterprises and anything in between. But for us in K2, we are exclusively, I would still say, we focus on the core hyperscale business. That's our forte, that's our history. We started the business in 2016 in Dublin, and that's the kind of market there, and we brought that expertise into APAC. And we remain very optimistic that despite some of our existing customers already self-building, that doesn't kind of impact our business case from the start. I think the requirement for core data centers, regardless of where you're located, remains the same as a third-party service provider. Our offering is basically time to market. At times, self-build programs don't go according to plan, or the demand is way faster than your own self-build programs is one. And I would say particularly in emerging markets, development risk is very real. We are building here, so we know what it is. The local champions in the space are potentially, way more experienced. But anyone coming in new, you have to test the supply chain, so that you can only do it by building yourself. So you can't have a standing start. So when a demand comes and then you're trying to test the supply chain, you're too late. You would likely, even if you win a deal, you would fail in terms of execution. That impacts your reputation. You might get that one contract, but you get no further contracts because you failed. So that's I think that's I'll give more time to my friends on stage. Yeah, thanks.
Billy, you deal with a lot of hyperscalers at DCI. Maybe kind of talk about kind of build on what ZP talked about in terms of how it impacts what you guys do and what kind of value you're able to deliver being a local operator.
Yeah, happy to. I think adding on to the first point about what has changed, I think with more players coming in, I think it somewhat validates the choices that has been made previously. Like for instance, you see the regions where the distribution of where this, in the east of Jakarta and also now central, it's kind of validates the choices that have been made earlier from the early movers such as DCI. But it's more exciting is that, as you mentioned, the Indonesian market is growing healthily. There's a lot of demand that's coming in from local and also from, I think there's a bit of hype as well with the data center industry, right, in Indonesia, such that people are, investors and operators are more keen to try and test out the market because, I think just also validates the fact that the government is supportive towards the investment. They are trying to have a good relationship with different sides, both with the west and the east side of the world, and that it's conducive for business in Indonesia. I think that's why the growth has been very healthy in terms of both supply and demand. And I think on the hyperscale side, building on ZP's point, yes, there is self-build, but at the same time, sometimes they are looking for speed to market. They are looking for someone who knows execution. They want to hedge their risks. They want to distribute their locations. So that's the main offering for operators like ourselves. So even though they're self-built, there are times when there are changes, some things, and they may not know best what to do, for instance, maybe like AI, then they look out for operators like ourselves. Like, okay, they come and discuss with us.
And we'll circle back to self-build, but I wanted to, and the reason we asked Dondy to come is because we a bit of a unique perspective, because you're in also the managed infrastructure cloud business as well as co-location. So in terms of this discussion, I think what's interesting, we talk about kind of, global platforms coming from the data center side, but also you are competing basically against AWS, Google Cloud, right? Because you sell servers, you sell infrastructure. I think that often doesn't get discussed, but SMBs, mid-tier that you serve, you sell colo to them, you also sell private clouds. Right. Tell us how they're, with the entry of these big platforms, also the Chinese clouds, how that's impacted how end users consume infrastructure.
Okay, so I'm running two businesses. I'm running the data center arm and also the cloud arm of Biznet. But unlike these three gentlemen, I think they are competing to each other. We're not really competing with them because we are, from a data center standpoint, we are focusing on the enterprise rather than the hyperscale. So from the get-go, we don't see a hyperscale because our data center is, our build is not as big as DCI, for example. So that's why it's not really sexy for us to take a hyperscale as the customers. And also we have, running the cloud arm as well. So the impact of us is when, from the data center perspective, is when the customers moving out to the cloud. But then again, we have our cloud arm, then we can offer the customers that, hey, we can offer you the cloud as well with the, cost that probably better than the hyperscale. So, but it's still impacting us. But right now we see some trends that customers try to repatriate from the cloud to back to the on-prem, which is, on-prem is not on their office, but back to data centers. And I see that this trend is keep growing. I projected next year, well, our internal projection, because we do a budgeting this year, this month, it's going to be double the customers that are going to repatriate, because now there are, their business is impacting by the cost of hyperscalers. That's actually, the dream of doing hyperscale is supposed to have a, better cost, but actually it's, the cost is higher than they expected. Yeah.
So I was going to ask you guys, and on that topic, have you seen, at DCI, that you have enterprise customers, or have you seen some of that dynamic where they are kind of maybe retiring some of their co-location, moving to the public cloud, or actually, they moved back from public cloud and decided to expand their co-location, or are you seeing more like cross connects because they want to, operate in both environments and scale when they need to? Maybe that's probably for Billy or an Oscar.
Yeah, I think both ways. I think it's more of like which part of the journey or the cycle that they're on. Typically, companies will always look for simplicity first. They will go up to the cloud, and we're still seeing that, of course, because in the enterprise market, it's still nascent, right? A lot of companies in Indonesia are still very comfortable of having their servers in the back room. So it is still a journey, but at the same time, those with, of course, I think everyone here knows very well that when you have a consistently high load, then it's when you're thinking about, okay, we know it's more complex, but give us the cost-benefit analysis. And yes, we are getting those kind of, more of those requests, like, hey, if we bring it to hybrid, then what does it look like, right? And that's why things like bare metal comes in, which we offer, because they still want to they still want to operate more on an OpEx basis than more on CapEx. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Billy mentioned. All the demands are in Indonesia right now is driven by a lot of the startups using the clouds, right? And there is a huge pressure on the startups, to be Abieta positive, and by using the public clouds that's available right now, the cost is very high. So actually, some of them actually, started thinking of going back to on-premise collocations or doing like bare metal services, to save the cost, to reduce their OpEx and make it more like a CapEx model. So yeah, we see that trend, and yeah, so I think we haven't seen it deployed in massive scale, but talking to some of the unicorns in Indonesia, those are the things that they're thinking. But the problem is that they only have like most of their tech guys are developers. Not many of them have seen like servers. So that poses a challenge for them to actually deploy the actual servers. That's probably Dondy comes in.
So they've been trained on cloud. They don't know.
They're born in the cloud, right?
Yeah, and they're also like 24 years old.
Yeah.
Okay. So one general question, I'm always interested in this topic in any market that I spend time in, that we as a research group spend time in, which is kind of how, and Dondy, we've talked about this too, is how far along, is our enterprises organized, start mid-sized organizations, financial services, how far along are they in using outsourced infrastructure? Is there, is it still, we've always talked about this as a emerging market relative in the early in the maturation cycle, but we've been talking about that for 10 years. Where are we, you think, today? Has it, started to move? Obviously, public cloud has started to pick up and accelerate that movement. There are these the startups and the young people who are just jumping on to cloud, but what about all that other footprint out there? And maybe I start with you, Dondy, because you knock on doors still.
Again, for the enterprise, it's very simple. All the expense will be, against all the revenue. And when the CFO asking the CIO or the CTO, hey, when we are moving to the cloud, are we gonna, be more productive so we can get more money, or can we reduce the cost, right? So when the public cloud came, the idea when the CIO or CTO said, hey, I can do cost reduction as well as I can increase the revenue as well because it's gonna be more productive, more efficient. But at the end of the day, I got one customer last week, I met him, and he said, I thought that when we move to the cloud, we're gonna cut the cost by half because there's employee costs, there's infrastructure costs, and the other costs. But eventually, the cost of using the hyperscale is twice of our previous cost. So that's why next year they're thinking to go back to our co-locations. So they're buying servers and whatnot. But again, some other enterprise who actually already enjoy the OpEx, they want to move to a bare metal because they still can configure whatever they want, but they don't have to buy their own hardware and servers. So that's, in terms of the maturity, again, enterprise is back to the cost. It's never been whether they want to outsource or keeping hugging the servers back to the office, but it's always coming back to whether it can give them more money or they can reduce some of the costs to get better profits.
Okay. I think we talked about that topic well. We want to move back to self-build, maybe talk about the big questions of the day in this market, which are around, is self-build going to increasingly become popular, and how does that impact the supply-demand situation? Some people will say this market is slightly in an oversupply situation, or are we tracking that way, or do you perhaps disagree? Maybe ZP, you start. You had some thoughts already on self-build, but what could you add to that that would answer these kind of big questions?
I think I would add that the self-build programs will not go away. There are legitimate reasons that are explained to service providers like us why it's important for them to self-build. Primarily it's over sovereignty of these are ultimately infrastructure that house proprietary technology and data. So the self-build programs satisfy number of factors, including even the operational excellence that they demand, because statistically in their own different universe, when they do a global analysis of failures, they tend to blame us. They blame the third party supply, the suppliers, service providers for massive big events. I don't know how true is that, but that's the feedback. Therefore, the swing towards self-build is one of also really it's a matter of providing that consistency and service reliability to their own end customers. So that's not going to go away. but it's always back to I think back to the same kind of few points that I mentioned, that there is still a unique selling factor for operators like us. That's why there's a business. In maybe additional points beyond that, certain markets are deemed maybe too risky for investment dollars in that sense. So it's easier to bite size and lease and operate on that. So you limit the risks. That's one aspect that people do forget. And a lot of the times it's due to talent. If you want to self-build, you actually invest a lot of money into the people that deliver these projects. It's end-to-end, all the way from the site selection / business development guys. You have a huge team, you need a huge team to look at it, speak to the government, speak to utility companies. Then you have a huge engineering design team, you have a huge actual construction management team, there's a whole procurement side of things. Sometimes people at the top have to make a choice. If you have finite pool of talent, how are you going to allocate it, right? Is it to Jakarta today, tomorrow Manila? There's only that limited pool of people that can do this well, and therefore I still think in certain markets that there would be a decision in which let's rely on a trusted partner that can execute well to deliver the product that we need, and that's why we're here to stay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
And Billy, I want to ask you, and I've tried to make the argument earlier that these things will start to happen when the first wave comes to an end. The second wave may look quite different. You might see more or less. How do you view what's coming in terms of hyperscale decision making around self-build or leasing? Do you see any changes coming? How do you think that will play out, and how do you think that will impact the supply and demand situation in the market?
Yeah, I think the decisions will be made partly on how the macroeconomy is doing as well. I think what we're seeing here, the latest news is saying that we may be seeing a soft landing, right? If there's a soft landing, then if it's going to pick up more quickly, what we may see is that the hyperscalers, for instance, may not have enough, I think what ZP mentioned, the speed to market and execution that the colo players have. So even traditional self-builders may consider a different approach just to make sure that they can build a certain amount of capacity and scale that they need on time. So I think you had a chart on the tendency of self-builds. Yeah, exactly, self-build versus colo. That may be shifting just because the market is quite dynamic at the moment. That's what I would add.
Okay, and Oscar, an interesting angle I wanted to touch on was that you're operating squarely in the edge hyperscale. So you're not. How is that different when it comes to self-build? Because we don't see a lot of self-building, obviously, because you can't get the economies of scale and justify. You need scale if you're one of these guys, to self-build. So is it something you have to deal with, or how does that happen?
So I think what's unique for us is that although there's always been discussion and debates about self-build or leasing, what I personally think that for all these hyperscale will definitely not do self-build is for their network node, because for them to have a network node, it has to be in a carrier dense data center, right? And that can only be players like us, where we have all the a lot of carrier connectivity in our data centers. It enables those hyperscale to connect to as many eyeballs as they want. So that will be a differentiator in the market.
And how do you see so you saw my map of the kind of the hyperscale architecture between center east and further east. Obviously the center one is smaller, but how do the hyperscalers view central Jakarta when it comes to availability zones, or kind of what they like to call edge nodes, or the AWS local zones, and what Microsoft and Google will eventually build or are building that is the equivalent of that?
Yeah, Some of the hyperscales actually looking at Jakarta still as one of their main AZ, probably because maybe they need like a more latency sensitive workload. So that's where we're trying to capture those market and deliver to the hyperscale.
Yeah, that's great view. Dondy, I want to ask not necessarily a somewhat related question. So we've talked about kind of hyperscale architecture, how that's playing out across Jakarta. You have an asset in the south. There's less activity there. Just want to hear your perspective on how you think this center east and further east, how might that change? You have a connectivity centric asset, but and you talk to these guys too. What's your general take?
Yeah, well, my general take is similar like the SCBD. So right now the east of Jakarta becoming the SCBD of the data centers. That's why a lot of players are moving or building the data centers over there because they see that if, for example, like DCI run out of capacity, then the customers can go to my data centers, or that's why the entity DCI is like in front of each other. So that's my take. It's just the SCBD because when it's like a gold mine, right? And also on the east side they got the better supply of electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the center or in the south side we only can rely on one company, but in the east side there are another company, the private company that probably give a better supply of electricity. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. Doing okay for time? I wanted to definitely we got a lot of time. We talked a lot about Jakarta, and this is it was an APAC forum, but we should, and actually I think in your program it's Invest in Indonesia. It's kind of so we should just quickly. I know that Indonesia is a very, like many markets across Europe and Asia, very centralized around, of course, what's happening here. But we're getting to the point where decentralization is happening in places like North America and Europe, and here a little slower pace. I think maybe like Japan, right? It's now got 2 hyperscale markets. Sydney has 2 hyperscale markets. Mumbai probably is going to have 4. Not Mumbai. India will have 4. But how do you see this playing out in Jakarta? Are we, there's been talk that there will be, a second emergent market. I think some people speak around Surabaya, but there's not really much activity. So how are you approaching that, and do you think that will, happen sooner or later? Yeah. I'll open that up to, and you can.
Well, maybe I can start. I think Surabaya is definitely, the second, I would say like a market for new upcoming edge or hyperscale data center deployment, just because it's the second largest city in Indonesia. But talking to some of the hyperscalers, there are certain things that they would like to understand better, such as the interconnectivity, such as the connectivity between Jakarta and Surabaya, whether or not the IX is still centralized within Jakarta IX. So if Jakarta fails, then Surabaya definitely will fail, right? Mm-hmm. So all those things are still being studied by by us and also some of the hyperscale to see whether or not is it 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, or further down the road.
Yeah, and actually the other part of this story is what's happening in Singapore, flowing over to Johor Bahru, Batam, and Bintan, if I said it correctly. But maybe Billy, you talk about how because that would be a second market for DCI Indonesia. So maybe tell us a bit how you're approaching that and what's driving it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the case for overflow market like Bintan is more because these conditions in Singapore, right? People need capacity, and that's why we are. It's in our strategic mindset to have to be ready when that flows over, essentially when that realizes. So the thinking is that it's very close to Singapore still, less than an hour by ferry. So that's the mindset of like having being very close to a very connectivity centric big market like Singapore. But adding to Oscar's point, like Surabaya and the others, the hyperscalers are still looking into, okay, there is a lot of demand, but we're also still looking, maybe we'll deploy a little just to make sure that we cater provide good service to the population over there. But we're not, I think it's still, as Oscar mentioned, maybe a few years down the road. That would, yeah.
Right. And ZP, you guys are operating in JB as well.
Yeah,
Right. But is that more, it's so, I mean, anyway, how is that in pursuit of a somewhat different opportunity, the Singapore overflow, or are you working with your customers to build, you know, kind of regional presence as you build out in Southeast Asia?
I mean, just to address your initial question about kind of an alternate or secondary market beyond Jakarta, I personally feel like I think we are still too early for that. I observe, unless there is something that we have seen, observed in the market where government or state bodies get involved to actually master plan specifically a large-scale data center campus or park that's state sponsored, that could work. That would really potentially funnel demand to a new place, and that could serve very specific use cases like a GovCloud project or AI deployment. So usually, the state has to get involved, which involves a lot of infrastructure, bringing the right type of power, not just power, the right type of power, because you're talking about sustainability, land that's already cleared, and potentially commitment in terms of how to bring talent to that area. Because again, while we don't employ a lot of people, but eventually there would be very highly skilled technicians and engineers that need to work in the data center, and our customers themselves do deploy their own employees to manage these infrastructure. So again, you can't ignore it, that there's this possibility that could come, but we haven't seen it yet. In terms of the overspill market wise, I guess I follow where the customers are going. That they're obviously, I have kind of industry friends here that have gone to Batam. We have gone to Johor, and it's not necessarily means that we are not going to Batam either. It's just that the first wave of demand has landed in Johor for their own reasons. Johor right now is, I would say, Malaysia as a whole. Someone earlier, a panelist did describe that there is a lot of government support for the industry, and that drives a lot of this, I would say, movement in terms of where data center capacity goes. But in the end, these are large capital projects. Every percentage point counts. Every tax incentive counts. Indonesia, I would still say we here in Indonesia still face some level of, from an end customer perspective, barriers to scale further because of, say, the import taxation on their servers, the chips. These are prohibitive for larger scale deployments. But so it's a nation-to-nation competition, frankly. If you want to attract larger scale capital projects, actually it's not just the industry. The government has to realize the economic value of these infrastructure, what value it brings to the economy, and support this project, support every part of the chain, not just corporate tax incentives. I mean, that is I would say it's just a minuscule part of the full value chain. Yeah. All right. Thanks.
Maybe Dondy, we end with you. I know we're coming up to time, but talking about second markets, overflow markets, but how about we've talked about edge markets in Indonesia? I mean, there are clusters, large populations across the how many islands that make up this country. What do you guys? You want to try to address that as part of Biznet?
Yeah.
How would you? What do you envision, and what are the challenges?
Yeah, I think I can give different perspective, because when we build a data center, it's not only building the the building itself and also about the electricity, but there's one thing called connectivity, right? The problem in Indonesia right now, the biggest IX in Indonesia is still located in Jakarta. And there are regional IX, but then again, the owner of the biggest eyeball in Indonesia, they still routed the networks through Jakarta. So to build a data center in Surabaya to serve the Surabaya population right now, for example, it's not, it doesn't make sense because most of the traffic will be routed to Jakarta. And probably if you are a small ISP, then you connected to the regional IX, but then again, the eyeballs doesn't make sense. So that's why the industry of data centers, correct me if I'm wrong, Oscar and Billy, the industry of data center in outside Jakarta is relatively very small. Mostly it's for the DRC because we have deployment of data centers, small data centers, edge data centers smaller than what Oscar has in several cities, but we're using that for our own CDN. We're using that for our own customers because we also part of the we also have an ISP businesses, and then that's about it. But for the general market, I think until we solve the problem that the owner of the biggest eyeball wants to share their traffic to the region, it won't be solved.
Sorry, that's a great place to end. We're right up on time. So thank you all for the insights, and we'll be around to answer questions, I'm sure. Thanks.
Thank you.